Living in New York, winter can be a fickle season depending on the year. While some winters feel as though they were entirely devoid of snow, others felt as if the snow wouldn't stop falling from the sky. Probably the worst snowfall I had ever experienced is during the blizzard of 2001. That year, there must have been at least 4.5 feet or more of snow piled up after the 3-day storm had finally ended. I had just turned 19 and moved into a small 2-bedroom house with a friend of mine from high school, and honestly, the first day it snowed was a bunch of fun. We played in the snow with our neighbors' kids like a couple of overgrown children, and then even had hot chocolate after warming up inside. However, everything started to take a turn for the worst after waking up the following morning. Initially, we had expected the snow to stop at some point overnight, and though we loathed the idea of shoveling the driveway, we figured the roads would be good enough for us to drive to work. But that wasn't the case at all. At some point throughout the night, our power went out, which was later discovered was due to freezing power lines. And when I looked out my bedroom window, not only did I realize that it hadn't stopped snowing, but was awestruck by the amount that had accumulated overnight. In just the first 24 hours alone, it looked like almost 3 feet had piled up, and as far as we could tell, there was no sign of any snow plows. My roommate and I couldn't reach out to our families because the power was out, and neither of us had signed up for a cell phone plan yet, so until we managed to be dug out, we were on our own. By the time noon came around, the house had cooled down to the point where we could practically see our breath, and it almost seemed like the blankets weren't helping keeping in any of our body heat. But we did everything we could to just power through it, hoping that the power would be restored soon. That wasn't the case though, and as the sun went down, the house only grew colder. We lit a few emergency candles so that we could see and ate some cold-cut sandwiches for dinner as we held our hands over the candle's flame to keep warm. It didn't help much though, and by that point, I would have given anything to get warm. The rest of the night was tough, and we got hardly any sleep. Almost every second was spent hoping that the light, and more importantly the heat, would kick on. And on the morning of the 3rd day of the storm, I had an idea that to this day might be one of the dumbest things I've ever done. You see, when I woke up that morning, I noticed my car keys sitting on the coffee table, and I thought that I could somehow make my way out of the house and into my car. I might be able to turn it on and heat it up for a little while. Now that I'm a little bit wiser, I realize that most likely wouldn't have worked. But I never got to find out because as soon as I opened the front door, I saw that the snow had continued to pile and was now basically up to my chin. I didn't let that stop me though, so I put on the only pair of gloves I had, which were small and knitted poorly, and I began scooping the snow in as big of piles as I could and throwing it to the side. My process worked for about 5 minutes before my gloves had become entirely soaked. And had I stopped there, I might have been fine, but I decided to push on. I made it about 10 feet away from my front door before I basically dropped to my knees in pain. My hands had become so cold that they felt like they were on fire and being cut by a serrated blade. I made my way back into the house and took my gloves off to the most horrifying sight I had ever seen. From the fingertips down to just about the knuckle, almost all of my fingers had turned a deep purple as if they were badly broken. I tried to warm them over an emergency candle, but that only made them hurt even more. And to make matters worse, there was no way that I could make it to the hospital by myself, and we had no way of calling for help. Thankfully, the power ended up being restored by around 11 p.m. And on that 3rd night, shortly after the snow stopped coming down, the first thing we did was call 911, who was able to send an ambulance, though it took them about 2 hours to get to the house. While we waited, we let our families know that we were okay, aside from my hands. As soon as the paramedic took a look at my hand, they told me I was likely going to have nerve damage in my hand, but nothing prepared me for when the doctor told me that I was going to lose 2 fingers on my right hand, my thumb and index fingers. I suppose it could have been worse though. To this day, one of my favorite outdoor activities has to be skiing. If I'm not skiing, there's no reason for me to be out in the snow. Now, if there's one thing that you should always do before going up a mountain, is to make sure that you're prepared for anything. This one time, about a week and a half before my 27th birthday, I was celebrating a bit early with a couple of friends of mine. The 3 of us had saved up enough money to take a 2-week trip to Canada so that we could hit a few of the mountains up there. And honestly, it was beautiful at first. The way the snow was littered with small bits of green from the pine trees sticking out was like something you would see in the movies. Every second that we were there seemed exciting, and from the moment we landed, we couldn't wait to get our boots on and hit the slopes. But we landed later in the day. We got off the plane and took a cab to the car rental service that we were using, and the worker there recommended that we get a truck so that we could carry all of our gear, which sounded perfect to me. And in no time at all, we were checking into our hotel room and planning out the next day. The following morning, we all made sure to wake up early enough to grab a quick bite to eat on our way to the mountain. And within the first hours of being up, we were all happily tearing through the snow. It was perfect. The snow on the ground wasn't packed down too tight, and the snow falling around us made it seem like we showed up at the right time. Little did we know, the snow we were seeing was actually the outer edge of a blizzard that was heading right toward us. The weather turned faster than I had ever seen before, and without a second of notice, the sky was a deep gray and the snow was coming down much faster, limiting our visibility. We all met up in one spot and decided to call it a day, and one by one we began heading down the mountain. I had been skiing the longest and could help anyone if they needed it, so I decided to position myself in the back of the line in case anyone fell. However, as we made our way down the mountain toward our truck, the visibility only continued to get worse, and even though I thought I was following behind the group, I somehow managed to veer a bit off course and smacked right into a small tree that was poking out of the snow. I felt the wind knock out of me as I made contact with the tree and began tumbling forward. I hoped that my skis would just unclip as I hit the snow, but that wasn't the case. At one point, as I was rolling through the snow, my left ski dug into the snow, and as my body continued to fly forward, I felt something in my legs snap. I let out a piercing scream that luckily was able to cut through the storm and caught my friend's attention who was in front of me. He turned and made his way over to me and immediately knew that I needed assistance ASAP. We agreed that he wouldn't be able to get me down on his own, so he decided to go and get help. I was laying in the ice-cold snow for about 45 minutes before I finally saw the light of an EMT riding on a snowmobile coming up the mountain. He slowly moved me onto a sled-like gurney that was attached to the back of his vehicle, and we made our way down the mountain. Once I had gotten to the hospital, the doctor had to cut through my snowsuit to get it off and reveal my leg. I almost passed out as I saw the small bit of shin bone piercing through the skin. I had gotten a compound fracture, and I don't know what hurt worse, the bone breaking or the doctor pushing it back into place. In total, it took me 6 months to heal with a year of physical therapy on top of that. I'll never forget that trip. One of the nicest parts about having a large family is when you get to visit them for the holidays. And in 2016, I was going to do just that. At the time, I had been living in Northern California and decided to go stay with my parents for the holidays at their cabin in Colorado. I was planning it as a huge surprise too, and originally I had intended on just showing up unannounced. But instead, I came up with an idea that I thought would be infinitely better. I was going to show up at the cabin a few days before them, so that when they showed up, I could have it decorated for them. It was going to be amazing. So I figured out that my parents were going to be showing up at the cabin on December 20th of that year and decided to go there 2 days before them. But to make sure that I didn't accidentally spill the beans, I made sure not to talk to them at all after the 15th, to give myself some time to prepare. Now, if I had spoken to them, I would have found out that they had to cancel their flights to Colorado due to a blizzard that was set to hit on the 20th. But I had no clue, and on December 18th, I flew to Colorado and caught a ride to my parents' cabin, where I used the key that I had on my keychain to get in. The first night I just relaxed, but the entire next day I spent putting up the lights and setting up the living room to look nice for them when they showed up. But as the sun began to set, I noticed that it was starting to snow outside, and I immediately grew concerned. It only got worse from there. It was about 1 in the morning when I noticed the power went out around me, and I decided to give up on my surprise plan and called my parents to see if there was a generator. And as soon as they realized I was at the cabin, they freaked out. But not in the way that seemed like they were excited. They were immediately concerned and let me know that there was a really intense snowstorm heading my way. And when I told them that the power had gone out, they only worried more. You see, the driveway leading up to the cabins was a gravel path through the woods that spanned the length of about 2 football fields. In other words, with the snow piling up the way that it was, there was no way for me to get out. And to make matters worse, I didn't bring much food because I assumed my family would be bringing some. All I could do at that point was hope that the storm passed sooner than expected and I could get out of there. That wasn't the case though. It snowed for 5 days straight, and the service roads leading up to the mountain that I was on had apparently been shut down. My phone's battery was low, so I decided to turn it off for use in an emergency. And from that moment on, I spent most of my time reading anything that I could. I managed to keep the cabin warm using the wood that I had piled up the night that I got in, and I melted snow on the wood stove to make drinking water. But by the time the 4th day rolled around, I was starving. I hadn't had anything to eat in over 48 hours and was getting really desperate. I looked in the cabinets and ended up finding 3 cans of ravioli that had been in there for years, if not longer. At that point, I would have eaten anything though, so I didn't waste any time putting the can directly on the wood stove to begin heating up its contents. It only took me 10 minutes before realizing how bad of a decision I had made. In no time at all, I was keeled over, clenching my stomach in pain. I turned my phone on and called my parents to see if they thought it was serious. And after realizing the food that I had eaten was more than likely more than a decade old, they had me call the hospital, which transferred me over to poison control. That's when I learned how terrifying botulism was. According to the person I spoke to, if I didn't get help soon, there was a chance that my body would become deeply infected and I could ultimately die. They ended up sending a helicopter to airlift me to the hospital since the roads were still closed in the area around my cabin, and I'm glad they did. By the time they got there, which was only an hour after my call, I had developed a fever over 106 degrees and could feel an intense heat coursing through my body. I was hospitalized for 3 days afterward, 2 of which were spent simply monitoring my vitals and making sure that my organs hadn't been damaged.